right, so in 9.2, we're going to talk about right triangle trig still, and we're going to talk about trig ratios. So these are going to be ratios between the different sides of a triangle. So first, a symbol that we usually use for an angle is a theta. Okay, theta is how you say that. It's just from the Greek alphabet. When we're talking about our sides, the side that is opposite of our angle, of our theta, is just called the opposite side. And then we still have our hypotenuse. And then the other side that's touching the angle that's right next to it is the adjacent side. Okay, so when you're looking at your theta, you're going to look for the opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. And we're going to use these to find our trig ratios. And our first ratio is called sine. To find the sine value, you're going to do opposite over hypotenuse. Okay, so that'll be the opposite leg over the hypotenuse. And when we simplify, or when we're using this in our math, we usually simplify it to sin, sine of some angle. Okay, next we have cosine. Now cosine is your adjacent side over your hypotenuse. Okay, and cosine will simplify to cos of an angle. And then our tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. Okay, your tangent, you can also think of it, it is sine over cosine. That's how we get our opposite over adjacent. And when we're writing tangent, we write tan and then our other angle. Now, one way to remember this is up here, it's called SOHCAHTOA. Okay, so these letters all stand for something in these equations. So SOH is sine, opposite, hypotenuse. CAH, cosine, adjacent, hypotenuse. And TOA, tangent, opposite, adjacent. Okay, so that's one way to remember these three. Now, the next three are related to our sine, cosine, and tangent. Our cosecant is 1 over your sine value, or hypotenuse over the opposite, so it's flipped upside down. When we shorten this, it's CSC, cosecant. Now your secant is 1 over cosine. And so if we flip that upside down, that's hypotenuse over adjacent. And secant is just SEC. And our last one, cotangent, is going to be 1 over tangent. Since our tangent is sine over cosine, that means this one is cosine over sine, or adjacent over opposite. When we do that one, it's COT for cotangent. Okay, now the way that I like to remember which one of these go with which is counting the C's. So first, tangent and cotangent, those obviously go together because they both have tangent in them. Now when you're looking at the short version for sine and cosecant, notice if you count the number of C's total, there's just 2 in cosecant. Now if we're looking at cosine and secant and we count the total number of C's, there's 1 in cosine and 1 in secant, so that makes 2 total. So you can know which one's going to match up with which because you need 2 C's when you pair them together. Okay, if you matched cosine with cosecant, then you'd have 3 C's, that would be too many. Or sine with secant, you'd only have 1 C, and that wouldn't be enough. Okay, so let's do a couple of examples. So our first example, we have this triangle right here. We have our theta, and then 8, 15, and 17. So now if we're looking for our opposite side, that's our 8. right? That's opposite of our theta. 15 is going to be our adjacent side, and 17 is our hypotenuse. Okay, so for our sine value, we're going to do opposite over hypotenuse. So our opposite is 8 over the hypotenuse is 17. Now for cosine, we have adjacent over hypotenuse, and our adjacent is 15 over hypotenuse is 17. And lastly, our tangent, opposite over adjacent. So our opposite is 8 over the adjacent, 15. Okay, and that's our sine, cosine, and tangent. Now we're going to find cosecant, secant, and cotangent. So secant, remember, goes with cosine. Okay, so we're going to do hypotenuse over adjacent. So that's going to be 17 over 15. That's our secant. Now cosecant goes with our sine value. So we're going to do hypotenuse, 17 over the opposite, which is 8. And then cotangent is going to be adjacent over opposite, so 15 over 8. Okay, and that's all you have to do to find those values. Okay, now let's look at the next example. For this example, we're given the sine of theta equals 9 over 13. Now for this one, we're going to have to draw our own triangle. Okay, it doesn't matter which angle you put the theta in, so I'm just going to put it in the bottom. And if our sine is 9 over 13, we know sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so that means we can label our opposite side as 9 and our hypotenuse as 13, right? Opposite over hypotenuse. Okay, now we need to find the third side. So to do that, we're going to have to use Pythagorean theorem. So we know 9 squared plus b squared equals 13 squared. That means 81 plus b squared equals 169. If we subtract 81, we'll get b squared equals 88. When we do our square root, 88 doesn't have an exact square root, so we have to simplify. That's 11 times 8. 8 is 4 times 2. 4 is 2 times 2. So we have one group of 2's and then a 2 and an 11 left over. So our b is going to be 2 square root of 22. 11 times 2 is 22. Okay, now let's find our sine and our other trig values. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse. We already know that one. That's the one we're given, right? 9 over 13. Now cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So that's going to be our 2 root 22 over 13. Okay, then we need to find our tangent. The tangent is opposite over adjacent. So that's going to be 9 over 2 root 22. Now again, we have to be careful. If we have a square root in the bottom, we're going to have to rationalize that. So we're going to multiply it by the square root of 22 over itself. That's going to give us 9 root 22. The square root of 22 times itself is going to be 22. And then times this extra 2 will give us 44. So that will be our tangent. Okay, now let's look at our secant. So secant is going to be our hypotenuse over adjacent. So 13 over, not 9, over 2 root 22. So again, we need to rationalize. So we get 13 root 22 over square root of 22 times the square root of 22 is 22 times 2 is 44. And that's our secant. Okay, then our cosecant is the hypotenuse over the opposite. So that's 13 over 9. And our cotangent is adjacent over opposite. So 2 root 22 over 9. And those are our trig values. Okay, so pause your video and try examples 3 and 4. Before you do that, we're going to change example 4 to be 8 over 10. Okay, so try these ones and then press play and see if you got the right answers. Okay, so for example 3, we need to find our third side. So we have 20 squared plus 10 squared equals c squared. 20 squared is 400, 10 squared is 100. So we have 500. Now that doesn't have a square root, so we need to simplify. So that is 5 times 100, just 10 times 10, and 2 times 5. So we get a group of 2's and a group of 5's, and then we have 1 5 left over. So our C value is going to be 10 root 5, right? 2 times 5 is 10. Okay, now we can find our trig values, trig ratios. So the sine is our opposite 10 over our hypotenuse, which is 10 root 5. We need to rationalize. So we get 10 root 5 over, now root 5 times root 5 is going to be 5, times 10 is 50. And 10 over 50 is 1/5. So we should get root 5 over 5 as our sine value. Okay, now for cosine, we're going to be doing our adjacent, 20 over our hypotenuse. And if we rationalize that one, we get 20 square root 5 over 10 times 5, again, is 50. And 20 over 50 is going to be 2/5. So we get 2 root 5 over 5 for cosine. Okay, and then our tangent is the opposite over the hypotenuse, or over the adjacent. So that's 10 over 20, or 1/2. Our secant is our hypotenuse over our adjacent side. So that's going to be 10 root 5 over the adjacent, which is 20. Now 10 over 20 is 1/2, so we get the square root of 5 over 2. Cosecant is our hypotenuse over our opposite. So 10 root 5 over the opposite side is 10. 10 over 10 is 1, so we're just left with the square root of 5. And lastly, cotangent is adjacent over the opposite, and 20 over 10 is 2. Okay, and let's check our last one. So if we draw our triangle here, we know cosine is 8 over 10. So that means our adjacent side is 8, and our hypotenuse is 10, right? Adjacent over hypotenuse. So we need to solve for our last side. We have 8 squared plus b squared equals 10 squared. That's 64 plus b squared equals 100. If we subtract 64, we're going to get 36. So b is going to equal 6. Okay, so now when we do our sine, we're doing opposite over hypotenuse, so that's 6 over 10. Now we can simplify that, right? 2 goes into both of those, so really it's 3/5. Our cosine we know is 8 over 10, and again we can simplify that as well to be 4/5. Tangent is going to be opposite over hypotenuse, so 6 over 8. And if we simplify that, we get 3/4. Remember, secant goes with your cosine, so we're going to do hypotenuse over the adjacent. So 10 over 8, that's going to give us 5/4. Cosecant goes with our sine, so that's going to be the hypotenuse over the opposite, which is going to be 5/3. And then our cotangent is your adjacent over your opposite, and that's going to simplify to 4/3. Okay, and those are all of those trig ratios. Now, we can also use our calculator to find our values. So when you have your calculator, the first thing you want to do, you have to be in degree mode. So to check that, you just click on mode right here next to the second. And here's where it says if you're in degree or radian mode. So if your radian mode is highlighted and not degree, just scroll over to the degree and hit enter, and it will change to degree mode. Okay, then you can clear out of that. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is the sine of 9. So we have the sine of 9 degrees. Your sine button's right here. Hit enter. You get about 0.16, I think it was. Yes. Okay, now let's look at our cosine of 37. So cosine's right next to sine of 37. So that is about 0.80. So about 0.80. Okay, we're rounding to 2 decimal places. And our last one, we have the tangent of 48. And again, tangent is just right here next to the others. That's going to be about 1.11. Okay, if you are not in degree mode, you will get the wrong answers, so always make sure you check that. And then one last thing is we're going to do the secant of 16, just to show you, because your calculator does not have secant, cosecant, or cotangent. But we know that secant is the same as 1 over cosine. So if we do 1 divided by the cosine of 16, that's going to give us our secant value. So 1 divided by cosine of 16 will tell us that our secant is about 1.04. Okay, so if you're asked to find secant, cosecant, or cotangent, you'll have to find your relationship to sine, cosine, or tangent and do it that way. Besides that, that is all we have for 9.2.